Everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for our webinar, which will look at reimaging business, security, and human rights in COVID-affected and fragile contexts. I am Christina Bache. I am the chair of our working group on Business for Peace, and I am also a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where I'm a part of a research team that looks at the role of business and industry in fragile and conflict-affected environments from a human security perspective. For folks who are new to our working group, we were launched in 2014 and aim to promote understanding and learning about the role of business in fragile and conflict-affected environments. We have, happily to say that we have our two founding chairs of our working group with us today, Robert McNulty and John Katzos, as well as our vice chair, Bob Sinha, on the call today. I'd like to turn the floor over to Sophie, who will tell us a little bit about PRIME, followed by Maya, who is our assistant, and she'll tell us about housekeeping and how to get involved in our working group if you are interested in doing so. So Sophie, if I could ask you to go ahead, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Christina. Yeah, so PRIME is, for those that don't know, is the Principles for Responsible Management Education. I am a coordinator currently at the Secretariat, so the head office in New York, and working with the working groups and chapters of PRIME. And just a little bit about PRIME and the initiative. We're the largest organized relationship between the UN and management-related higher education institutions. So our vision is really to realize the Sustainable Development Goals through our principles, which, very similar to the Global Compact, if you're familiar with those, are just principles that are used as, that are tailored to academia, and they act as vehicles to the SDGs. So we are housed and administered by the Global Compact, and we are currently at over 800 higher education institutions in over 95 countries that are working to implement these principles. So yeah, just a little overview. Maya, I'll let you go ahead and do kind of some housekeeping, and then we can just get into it.
I think Maya may be muted.
Sorry, here. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. As some of you may know from our previous events, we are currently working on a series of online webinars. The upcoming one should be held by the end of June. For that, we will definitely keep you posted with all details. You can also stay connected with us through our website and by following us on our social media platforms. It's listed down below in the chat section. I just posted it. If you have any questions, or also we have just relaunched our website, and it features a growing library where you can have access to a wide variety of materials, publications, and podcasts, all related to Business for Peace. And if you have any questions or inquiries, please contact us anytime on the email, also listed within the chat section. And now I will pass the floor back to Dr. Christina Bache, the chair of our working group and the moderator of this session. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Sophie and Maya. Well, yes, let's jump right into our presentation. We are very delighted to host our guest speakers today to talk to us about their work on reimaging, or the topic of the webinar is reimaging business, security and human rights in COVID-affected and fragile contexts. They'll specifically highlight the institutional partnership between DCAF and ICRC and their work to address security and human rights challenges faced by corporate actors in complex and fragile contexts. We have Alan Bryden from DCAF and Claude Voillat from ICRC, who present their work for about 20-25 minutes. And then we will have about 15 to 20 minutes, give or take, for Q&A. And just one note, because we have so many confirmed participants for today's webinar, we had 180 registered, and folks are still coming in. We just don't have the time to give the floor to each person who has a question. So we'd like you instead to ask your question in the Q&A section that's on the bottom portion of your screen. If you could kindly indicate your name and your institutional affiliation along with your question, and feel free to go ahead and ask your question before the Q&A time if you feel so inclined to do so beforehand. So if I could go ahead and turn the floor, or turn to Alan and Claude to give us your presentation. We're looking very much forward to your thoughts on your work.
Thank you. Yes, I hope you can hear me. Can you just confirm you can hear me? No.
Yes, we can hear you. Sorry, we were all muted, just nodding. Yes.
You threw me in doubt. So thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Maya, for this introduction. Thank you, Prime and Business for Peace. It's a pleasure for Alan and me to be able to present to you. We are indeed going to share this presentation. We say a special thank you also to all those who are participants in this webinar, with a special thought to those we have already worked with and we know, based in Australia, good night Australia, based in Canada, in the States, in London, in Geneva, and so on and so forth. So the theme of the webinar is Reimagining Business, Security and Human Rights in COVID-affected and fragile contexts. I'm Claude Voillat, the ICRC guy on this presentation, and Alan will speak to you very soon to introduce DCAF. But first of all, let's have a look at our roadmap. 4 different sections. The first one is a short and sharp presentation of DCAF-ICRC partnership. A second one is about multi-stakeholder approaches, which is very much the way we work in this partnership. The fourth one is to look at what COVID-19 is doing to our work, consequences and responses, and a block for question and answers. So let's start with the first block, the DCAF-ICRC partnership. I guess most of you probably know a little bit of the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross. In one sentence, it's a humanitarian organization aiming at protecting and assisting people affected by armed conflicts throughout the world. Within this organization, there is a very little segment taking care of engaging with private sector actors to ensure that when they operate in conflict places, they do so in a way that does not create further mess. This is for the ICRC. DCAF is slightly less well known, and maybe I give the floor to Alan to introduce briefly DCAF.
Sure. Thanks, Claude, and let me add my thanks to Prime for the invitation, and to all of you for joining us today. Indeed, you know, when you get a box with ICRC on it, you tend to know what's inside. Probably DCAF, you suspect you're getting some coffee or something like that. Actually, DCAF is an independent Geneva-based foundation with around about 200 staff based in Geneva and field offices around the world. And we're a niche organization. We promote good governance of the security sector, meaning as an organization, we work with a range of national partners, with international organizations on the ground to promote greater oversight and accountability of the security sector. As well as the operational work, we also have a strong applied research component to and policy and influencing role to what we do. Now, within that work, we've noted for a long time that, of course, a good governance approach implies a multi-stakeholder approach, engaging with all actors that can advance security and development. But in reality, we often see that the private sector gets left out of those discussions. So the Business and Security Division, our focus is engaging constructively with business in these wider activities around security development and respect for human rights. Claude.
Thank you, Alan. So you know a little bit better of DCAF, you know why the ICRC is interested in business. Now let's have a look at what DCAF and ICRC together have been doing and how this partnership emerged. So essentially the partnership emerged through our common participation in various multi-stakeholders initiatives and our realization that when you are considering the issue of business security and human rights, the challenges met by the various actors and various stakeholders are incredibly complex. We are both organizations used to work in this complexity, and we thought that this is a field where we can bring something. On top of it, we also realized that this was a field where there were many knowledge gaps. There were many guidance documents, guidelines, good practices existing, but we realized there were many gaps between these documents, and we felt that maybe we can try and address these gaps. Third of all, we realized by consulting with various stakeholders that both of our organizations have an image of neutrality, have an image of legitimacy in this field, and were very much trusted by various stakeholders working in this business security and human rights field, which again gave us the impression that there is something we can do. Finally, and most important, and very importantly, we realized early on that we had good friends at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, in particular Human Security Division section, who believed in this field, in the work that we can do in this field, and who believed it enough to financially support our proposal. So this is how we decided to work on this field together as a partnership. Now, what did we do? The very first thing we started doing when we started working together about 8 years ago was to have a wide consultation of a large number of stakeholders in the business security and human rights field to try to understand what is needed and where we can add value. And the result of this wide consultation was that there were two things we were requested or suggested to develop. One is a knowledge hub. This is the next slide. And the other one is a toolkit. This is this slide. And we developed these tools. These tools are today available. The toolkit is essentially a practical guidance to facilitate responsible security management. It's a thick document, but it's a document that is very easy to use. Nobody has to read the whole document to be able to use it. You can go to various sections and use the parts that are directly necessary or useful to your activities. It's a way, it's a document, it's a tool to help you implement human rights due diligence in complex environment. It is filled with recommendation and good practices in response to real life security and human rights challenges. It's very focused on implementation, very concrete as much as possible. It connects with the UN guiding principles, and it weaves in the Agenda 2030. This document is free of charge. It's available through the link you see on the top of the screen in English, Spanish, French, and Chinese. This is a very first concrete thing that we did. A second one, very concrete thing, is the Knowledge Hub I mentioned earlier. The actual picture that you see of the Knowledge Hub is not the one you will find if you go today on the Knowledge Hub. It's the one you will find in a few weeks, because we are revamping the Knowledge Hub to make it more user-friendly, more practical, more sharp and more modern in its look. So here it is how it will look like. But most importantly, the Knowledge Hub, what it is, it's a web platform compiling guidance and tools on security and human rights issues. So basically, it's a one-stop shop where anybody interested in security and human rights and looking for practical guidance, not for press articles or academic articles, but practical guidance. In principle, you will find it on the Knowledge Hub. If you don't find it, if your organization has developed practical tools that are not on the Knowledge Hub on this security and human rights theme, please let us know and we will consider adding this. So these are the two main tools that were developed in the very early stages of our partnership. And then after then, a number of other tools were developed. We are not going to run after all the tools we have developed, but maybe one of them is particularly interesting. This is this one, Security and Human Rights Implementation Mechanism. And I will give the floor here to Alan, because this is a tool that is essentially managed by DCAF. Alan?
Alan, before you, can I kindly ask Claude to enlarge the screen? So on your, at the very top, if you go to view, yes, perfect, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Alan?
Thanks. Well, you know, Claude elaborated on our work that we've done jointly, which is really in the area of outreach, engagement, and good practice development. But also, you know, both our organizations are fundamentally operational in orientation and try and promote positive behavior change on the ground. And certainly through our engagement, we've seen a number of challenges to the implementation of security and human rights programming in fragile contexts. I think you all know the tune, short-term projects, lack of a programmatic approach, lack of coherence at the policy level, and sustainability on the ground. And as I said a little bit before, you know, often limited genuine private sector engagement in these activities. So back in 2016, DCAF with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office established the what goes by the acronym, the SHRIM, the Security and Human Rights Implementation Mechanism, as a kind of multi-donor, multi-actor mechanism to support field-based projects in this field that are essentially multi-stakeholder in nature. And by that I mean that bring together business actors, national authorities, security providers, community actors, to create space and promote sort of positive change on the ground. Underlying objectives as well of this is joining the dots. So on the one hand, linking international initiatives that are all pushing in the same direction, but also trying to link knowledge communities. A lot of what we're discussing here goes within the framework of responsible business conduct or business and human rights, but is intimately linked to security sector reform, to peace building, even if there are, you know, stovepipes and blockages between those communities. So bringing those together, and also a strong commitment to lesson learning and sharing knowledge. So that tool, the trust fund, has grown quite significantly since then. Our projects since then have impacted in 23 different countries, in particular in fragile environments. And the pool of supporters has grown. Switzerland, the UK, Norway, the Netherlands, and, well, the slide is out of date actually, because Germany too is a recent supporter. So this is another sort of tool in our toolbox, if you like, which is particularly focused on implementation. But I'd like to move on and maybe focus a little bit on why multi-stakeholder approaches. And I think there's a clear rationale for that. I think firstly and fundamentally, getting all the stakeholders around the table is the only way to build trust, to find a common language, and to look for those blended interests in difficult situations, which aren't immediately visible, and certainly aren't visible unless you figure them out together. I think secondly, there's a key point around innovation. Working together is actually the only way to find new responses and prevention-based responses to the kind of challenges that are often solved after the problem has happened. Third, simple but very true, collective action generates more leverage, or can do. And I think the final point I would make is around coherence. I think at the international level, often we all have our own clubs that we're members of, initiatives and others. They have their own names, their own language, their own logos. But of course, all of this is, at the point of delivery on the ground, is absolutely meaningless and rather an alphabet soup. So there's a real need to integrate and join efforts where they can. And I think these kind of approaches can do that. And I think on one level, we see this with different international standards and initiatives. The UN guiding principles, the voluntary principles on security and human rights that Claude alluded to, the UN Global Compact. Here, when I talk about the OECD, I'm referring to the responsible business conduct work stream and the work that's out of there. I also highlight the International Code of Conduct Association for Private Security Service Providers, very innovative multi-stakeholder initiative in the area of private security. I think rather the point I would make is, from a values-based perspective, all these initiatives are closely aligned, yet in practice, the synergies between them are often latent. They have high visibility, significant convening power, the same logic of constructive engagement. And I think fundamentally, and this is where the rubber hits the road, all of them are or will be judged by the impact that they have on the ground. And there's a lot of scope to increase that through the national action plan processes of the UN guiding principles. For the voluntary principles, the motor of implementation is in-country working groups. Business for Peace has its local networks. The OECD, for example, in the area of due diligence in supply chains, is supporting a lot of in-country work, and the same with ICOCA. So I think, to put it simply, all of these initiatives are stronger when there's a mutually reinforcing relationship between the international level and delivery on the ground. So maybe just to illustrate very, very briefly, one very practical example that we have supported. I mentioned that the multi-stakeholder in-country groups are the engine of the voluntary principles. Now, there's a number of those in-country groups in areas with significant issues around the extractive sector. In the DRC, there are existing groups in Kinshasa and in Katanga. But when the Netherlands were the chair of the initiative and visited the country back in 2017, they saw the need for a new group in South Kivu. Very different province, very different security and human rights challenges, particularly given the artisanal and small-scale mining that's prevalent there. So we were given a mandate to try and help set up a locally driven multi-stakeholder group. We developed a partnership with a very credible local actor, OGP, the Observatoire pour la Gouvernance et la Paix. And in looking at the situation on the ground, we saw that actually the OECD had already established a group there to focus on implementation of their due diligence guidelines, which already had high-level political support from the governor, from the Minister of Mines of South Kivu, and a whole load of local stakeholders. What it didn't have was a security specialization. So we created a subgroup directly linked and coordinated with the work of the OECD, focusing on the specific security and human rights issues, but benefiting from this wider political will and political framing. And since then, we've been supporting the group, which has its own secretariat, its own ownership and development through capacity building on specific areas, and also just helping them to mitigate security and human rights risks. And the group, since it was set up in early 2018, has really been quite successful already. In Batali, there was an issue around mining cooperatives who were occupying the same space, and conflict was posed because they both drew on local armed forces units and also armed groups to provide security, creating real tensions and real risks of harm. So the working group facilitated a mediation process between the cooperatives, and they agreed on a coexistence and renounced the use of these groups. But at the same time, because it's a multi-stakeholder group that also includes representation from security actors at a higher level and from governance actors, the group also highlighted this to the FARDC general in charge for the province, and he ordered the immediate withdrawal of the armed forces units from the mining sites, which in any case was contrary to the law. So just to show that this multi-stakeholder approach, you can come at problems from different angles. So of course that doesn't mean, the working group is very active, which shows the number of challenges that are there, but just one very practical example of trying to put these principles into action. Claude.
Great. So this was a very concrete example of field activities that are led through the joint work of DCAF and ICRC. There are a number of other junctions that are made with other groups, again, under the headline of our multi-stakeholder approach. We have, in particular, developed a number of partnerships with academic institutions. You have two here described on the screen. I'm not going into the details of them, just saying that the first one is headed like under the title of Queen's University, but actually it's broader than Queen's University. Queen's University is a university in Canada. Behind this university, there are a number of other academic institutions participating in this partnership together with us, DCAF-ICRC, and together with two large mining companies. The objective of this line of work is to work on the issue of conflict prevention in mining areas. This is an ongoing one, very promising. Another one, and this one is very, very fresh because I think the formal agreement papers have been signed yesterday, is a partnership with University of Geneva, Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. We are very excited about this one, and under this partnership, we are going to work at the updating of the DCAF-ICRC toolkit that I introduced earlier, with new content, new case studies, tools, good practices, making this toolkit very, very up to date. These are two examples, and now we are also looking at our relationship and partnership with Chinese stakeholders. And there we have been able to develop a partnership with CCCMC, which is the largest industry association covering the mining, the extractive industry for Chinese companies across the world. Under this partnership, we hope to be able to better understand the needs of Chinese stakeholders in their operations, and we hope to be able to enjoy facilitated access to Chinese stakeholders for our work. And then finally, DCAF-ICRC CCCMC partnered together with the fourth block, which is Renmin University in China, in Beijing. And again, the idea with this partnership is to develop a set of very concrete tools, which will be training modules on responsible business and security management in complex environments, targeted specifically at Chinese stakeholders. So this is just a few examples of the various connections that we have been doing, that we have been completing through our work. Now we will move further, and obviously if you have questions on these various elements that we have just mentioned, we will try to tackle this during the Q&A. Now we move to the third and last section before the Q&A of these presentations, which is related to the present pandemic crisis, and we try to show you how we could react to this. Alan.
Thank you, Claude. Well, I think it's clear, as with all of us, you know, we certainly see from our work that the COVID crisis is creating new challenges and maybe exacerbating old ones as well. It has a clear impact on businesses, on livelihoods, on the rights of workers in different sectors, and certainly exacerbates social tensions and labor relations in a number of contexts. I'd say from our perspective, which is really looking at the security optics of this, there are a number of more specific sort of implications or things that we're seeing. One is that security forces are not necessarily or always sensitized to appropriate behavior in light of the conditions created by the virus. Another is that in many contexts, private security is getting new roles that haven't been the case before. Enforcing confinement, social distancing, curfews, protecting medical personnel, and also working hand in hand with public security forces to an extent that maybe hasn't been experienced before. And of course, if you look at all of this, it's set in a context where things like human rights training and vetting are not happening to the degree that's needed. So those are some of the challenges. But rather, for this conversation, I think it's more important to highlight and talk about innovative responses that we see and that are being developed, and hopefully can be replicated. So there, maybe just to give three snapshot examples. One, Peru is one of those countries where there is not one but two in-country working groups for the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And interestingly, the Lima-based group, whose secretariat is the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, has a dual mandate linking the voluntary principles to the implementation of the UN guiding principles. And I think, again, that's one of these synergies, and it also enables a more clear and effective communication and engagement with government actors in Peru. But we're working with the Institute to develop a survey of current needs, experiences, and challenges in the security and human rights space faced by companies, state actors, and civil society in relation to COVID, because we really see a need and a gap in terms of this kind of baseline analysis to inform work at the national level, but also to help the international level and how things can be steered there. As a second example, Kenya is one of those contexts where private security has assumed a very high-profile role as a first responder in the context of COVID, but certainly with those concerns that I mentioned earlier, over training, over vetting, but also over treatment of personnel in terms of the risks to their safety and their working conditions. And all of this is exacerbated in a context where there's a real lack of oversight and accountability. So given the challenge of engaging directly and of actually traveling around the country, we've been engaging with a local partner organization, the Usalama Reforms Commission, to engage directly with journalists, to have video conferences with journalists in different regions of Kenya, to talk about the legal framework for private security, the state of the industry, and the monitoring role that the media can play around human rights issues. Community radio talk shows are being organized and TV slots to sensitize people to their rights in relation to private security. And I think most interestingly as well, that discussion's being enlarged to national regulators and national authorities, again, to come at these issues from different areas. A third example, very practically, the need to raise awareness on the good practices on security and human rights in Nigeria with the national police assigned around extractives operations, in a context where human rights training isn't happening as one would wish. And there, again, with a credible local partner, very experienced in police reform issues, PRAWA, they developed or are finalizing the development of an app that can be used and accessed by all police officers. And again, talking about this joining the dots, this project, which in a way is a bit of a micro project, it's not a huge project, has been linked to a wider police reform project that's supported by Switzerland, GIZ, and the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. And through creating that linkage, the app and the good practices are actually embedded in the national human rights training curriculum for the police, which gives it sustainability and kind of repeat value. So those are the examples. Maybe very, very briefly on wider lessons. I think the first one, and again, I speak from our perspective, is really the need for knowledge-based responses that reflect the realities on the ground. So often the absence of analysis and bottom-up research to infuse policy responses. But as well, knowledge is linked to monitoring, and the key role that civil society, that academic organizations, the media can play in bringing that information back. Second is linking initiatives and endeavors is, if it was important before, it's all the more important now that those kind of practical linkages I was talking about don't just happen in specific examples, but are really scaled. And the final lesson, which is maybe the oldest and most important of all, the best response to fragility and tension is resilient, empowered states where national stakeholders are working hand in hand, and that's really the thrust of all of this. So if I can maybe push to the last word and here, really speak on behalf of the ICRC and DCAF. I think if we have, one overall message to pass, it is that smart partnerships are more important than ever. And if I look at the principles for responsible management education, this is very much in line with the values and the approach of the DCAF-ICRC partnership. So that's the final word. We're very much open to partnership opportunities, whether it's joint engagement, sensitization, the development of good practices, finding real ways to link these different initiatives that we're tied into, and also in relation to the SHRIM, the implementation mechanism, if there are other partners, bilateral actors, foundations, and others who are interested in joining such a mechanism there as well, we're very open. So with that, let me again thank you, and I think we're gonna switch to Q&A now.
Great, thank you. It's always helpful to hear from the brains behind a publication. I know I looked through the toolkit, but it was very helpful to hear your presentations. So if I could kindly ask a few questions from our participants, and pardon me for making any grammatical mistakes in your names. We have a question from Gerard Farias from Farley Dickinson University, who asks, do you work on ensuring fair trade practices to ensure that multinationals are not draining these countries of their resources? And then we have a second question from Peter Knoop from Klingendale in the Netherlands. And he asks if you have any experience working with PMOs in sub-Saharan Africa that you can share here or now in a later stage. If we could ask or answer those two questions, and then we have a few more in the line.
Maybe, I'm not sure I understood the second one. If we have any experience working with who?
PMOs.
Okay, I will look stupid in front of everybody, but I don't know what is PMOs. So what is PMOs? Somebody knows?
If you want to iterate. I'm assuming PMO is a private military organization.
Maybe private military organizations, possibly. So in this case, I will elegantly leave the second question to Alan. The first one, fair trade practices, no, it's not an issue that we are tackling in any way, by the simple fact that we are really in our partnership focusing straightly to security issues, in particular, where the company rubs with civil society communities in locations. So it's fair trade is, we feel it's a little bit beyond our scope, beyond our capacities very clearly, and beyond the scope of our initiative. Alan?
Thank you. Indeed, when I was wondering too, and a huge amount of our work at DCAF is on private security regulation, but we suffer from the alphabet soup of different acronyms. So we don't work with private military organizations. What we do quite a great deal of is to support regulation and oversight of the private security industries. So private security companies that can extend from big international actors to local bucket shops. And we do that on two levels. One is through supporting implementation on the ground of international initiatives, like the Mantra document, which focuses on states and the role of states under international humanitarian and human rights law, and supporting implementation of the International Code of Conduct, which I alluded to before, which focuses very much on company responsibilities. But more directly, we work in different national contexts to reinforce different levers of good governance in this area. And just to give you what I actually mean there, we conduct baseline research, and a recent one that's just been published on the SADC region on entry points and challenges for regulation, which has already resulted in us providing national support in Madagascar to help the national authorities develop a more effective regulatory framework. We've also done that in other contexts where we've worked with the national parliament and other actors in Liberia, for example, to develop a new legal framework on private security. And maybe just one other initiative that I'd like to mention that we support is there is a network, a Pan-African civil society network called the Private Security Governance Observatory, which is a network of currently about 90 to 100 civil society organizations from around Africa that we support to enable civil society to be more effective in raising awareness, in monitoring private security, but also informing and supporting the public policy debate in different national contexts. So there's just a few examples for that.
So we have a few more questions. We have a question from Maha Abdallah. She asks, do any of your activities or efforts include direct communication with concerned businesses to prevent and stop their involvement in human rights violations in fragile and conflict-affected settings? We have another question from Alexander Noor from University of Cape Coast in Ghana, who asks if you've developed any exit strategies that can enhance the sustainability of your interventions. And if so, whether or not you have any case studies. He'd also like to ask if you have any collaborations with local universities and institutions to build responsible human resources to sustain your initiatives. Maybe I can go ahead and ask a third one from Hena Jamshed from the Global Sustainability Initiative in the UK. And her question is specifically for Alan. She's particularly curious about the work you have done with local police, and would like to see if you can elaborate on how police can play a role to deliver labor industry pertaining to industry. I'm a little unsure about the last bit of that question, but it looks like she's curious about the role that police can play in terms of maybe private sector engagement or development. But Hena, if you want to elaborate on that question, maybe you could just add some points in the Q&A section, and we can make sure that question is asked in the appropriate or best way that you thought needed to be.
Alan, what are you taking?
I'll take maybe first of all this sustainability question. I'm always a bit wary of the notion of exit strategies, because there's been plenty of exit strategies that have seen people come back rather quickly afterwards. So I do like the notion of sustainability and maybe transfer strategies. But what I want to say is that all of the kind of projects, the implementation projects that I described, are indeed designed and intended that the dynamics that are created, the centers of gravity in the activities, are not dependent on external support in the long term. Hence, on the one hand, capacity building being very core. One example I didn't give in the local working groups in the DRC. One of the key things that we were able to work with all the people in those groups on was incident reporting, developing effective ways to report on incidents, in a human rights incidents, in a balanced way. And since that, there's no need to go back and do that, because it's been done in such a way that the engagement of the group with companies and other actors has really changed a level and has been much more effective. And that's also been elaborated on things like gender and security, on child rights and other areas. But also the notion of a win-win. These multi-stakeholder groups also include government actors and companies, of course. And in the DRC, the group in South Kivu is at least partially funded and supported through national contributions. Equally in Peru, we see that when the groups add value, then there are ways that companies and others can support very, very practical things like providing the resources for civil society secretariat to continue the engagement. So those are the ways that we try and embed sustainability and ensure that it's not these things that just grind to a halt for whatever reason. I wasn't fully clear on the question relating to police and police issues, but we see this, both police and armed forces more broadly in this area, is as a key part of what we do, because often, you know, the security and human rights risks, they don't come from private security many times, because in many national contexts, private security is unarmed, and that's not the case with public security forces. And just there, I would emphasize that I think there's two levels to that focus that needs to happen. One is on human rights training, and I gave an example of that, and ensuring that human rights training linked to things like the extractive sector is linked to wider security sector reform activities, so that you can get sustainability. But secondly, that these are governance issues essentially, and there's no point in engaging in training if this isn't linked to, you know, oversight at the national level from executives, from parliament, from civil society, and others.
Thank you, Alan. Trying to catch on the other questions. The first one was about whether we have direct communication with companies in the field who have been violating human rights of communities or individuals. I would say this is not the way we are built, and this is not the main purpose of our activities. We are not running after companies when they have failed in their operations. We rather work on building the right environment, in particular through multi-stakeholder engagement, to avoid these kind of incidents happening, but not running after the incidents. This being said, it's very possible that occasionally through the work of some of these working groups, some of these issues related to violations or failures by companies will be addressed directly by the working groups and will be tackled at that level. But as a matter of principle and as a philosophy of our work, no, we are not running after companies to catch them once they have failed. And there was another question about us working with local universities. This can also happen through some of the field work that is being led. I think probably the most direct example is our work in support of the working group in Peru. The working group itself being managed by an institution that is essentially an academic institution. Now I'm looking at Alan because he is more in touch with this part of our activities. But IDEPUC is an academic institution, and we have been joining forces with them. The other example I mentioned earlier is the work that we are doing with Renmin University in China to develop these training modules. So yes, the straight response to your question, yes, it can happen in the course of our activities that we partner directly with local universities.
That's great. We have quite a few other questions, but for the sake of time, I'd like to ask Alan and Claude to wrap up. If you have a few things that you'd like to share with us, for maybe about 1 minute each for each of you.
Okay, Alan, are you ready? I was not prepared for this one, so but I can improvise.
No, I mean, I maybe just one thought, which I think links a lot of this. We started this work, DCAF and ICRC, really with a kind of what you might call, I suppose, an upstream focus, looking at, you know, very real on the ground security and human rights challenges around, you know, a very heavy footprint industry, which is the extractive sector. But as our work has evolved and different linkages were made, you know, we've really seen that actually the work is about responsible business conduct. It sits in many different areas, not just along the supply chain, but in terms of the roles that governments, investors, companies and others, the leverage they can have to promote in a mutually reinforcing way, you know, security, social and economic development, and human rights. And I think one of the things that we're always looking to try and do is say, well, we have a specialization, this is it, but at the end, we're all trying to move the dial forward in different ways. And how do we link different communities, maybe different ways of thinking the same problems? And those are discussions we're very, very happy to have from our perspective. So enlarging the issue there.
Thank you, Alan. On my side, I would say this is a very fascinating journey we have been on together with DCAF on this project. Fascinating because of the multiplicity of actors we have been able to work with. Fascinating also because the subject of business security and human rights is incredibly complex. We are definitely in a field where there is no situation we have encountered where there is a right and wrong answer, where it's black or white. It's always, you are always playing in a shade of nuances, and all the actors, companies first, and all the others who are trying to work in this field have to find their way through all these nuances. So this makes the travel very fascinating and very interesting. And this is also one of the reasons why we insist on working across sectors with a number of other stakeholders. Because of the complexity of the issues, we cannot, as DCAF or ICRC or even together, very often find a solution by ourselves. We need all the forces from various corners to work together to be able to tackle some of these very complex challenges that we are meeting. And this is also one of the reasons that we were very keen, who are participating, to demonstrate what we are doing and to try and encourage them to connect with us if they think, in relation to what we presented, they have good ideas, good connections, innovations, projects, etc., that could be discussed together. So that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you very much, Prime and Business for Peace.
Thanks, guys, so much.
Thank you so much. And we'll make sure that you get all of the questions and comments that were included. And for folks who joined, please do check out our website. The webinar was recorded and will be up on our website in the near future. And you can also see the recordings from previous webinars. And if you have any ideas for future webinar topics, please get in touch with us as well and share them. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much, guys.
Everybody.